All right, so we've introduced evolution and the processes behind it. So let's talk about some evidence for evolution. So we'll talk about direct observation, fossil evidence, shared characteristics amongst living organisms, and similarities and differences in DNA. There are several, um, well, let's say direct evidence. All right, let's start with that first. Direct observation allows scientists to see evolutionary changes that are happening within short spans of time, right? So direct observation. And we have all seen this. So the best example of this is bacteria evolving antibiotic resistance, right? So we have seen that through the generations that which bacteria can multiply very quickly, right? You can have go from one generation to the next within 30 minutes. And then over many generations, we have seen antibiotic resistance spreading. So since antibiotics were first introduced, we now have many varieties that are, excuse me, I was going to sneeze there for a moment. We have many varieties that no longer respond to the antibiotics. All right, so they have evolved. And insects, right? Insects have also developed resistance to certain pesticides. We see that also with plants and herbicides. All right, so this demonstrates how populations can adapt rapidly to environmental pressures. All right, so we see these adaptations that have come along. Now for fossil evidence, so our fossils provide a historical record of what has happened on life on Earth. So it shows how species have changed over millions of years. And transitional fossils are part of this evidence. So one of the most well-known transitional fossils is called Archaeopteryx. And Archaeopteryx shares features of both reptiles and birds, and it illustrates kind of the gradual evolutionary steps between these major groups of reptiles and birds. And actually now birds are considered to be reptiles. So Archaeopteryx is an example of a transitional fossils. So these fossils basically show intermediate traits between the ancient and the modern species. And your book shows the example of whales and how they evolved from an ancestor that lived on land and walked about on land. So showing at the bottom here the oldest ancestor, and then how over time we've got these transitional fossil species where they started to become much more, started to go into the water and are able to swim better than the original ancestor, and developing kind of the webbed feet, getting the shorter limbs, developing a blowhole, and then making our way up to the more modern day whale. Another line of evidence is that of shared characteristics among living organisms. So this could be similar bone structures in the limbs of humans and whales and bats, which I'll show you in a minute. So this these universal characteristics come from a shared genetic code, and that points to a common ancestor. So common ancestor, so it refers to a single organism from which many species have evolved. So a common ancestor could have given rise to many different species. And because of that, they show similarities because they got their DNA from that common ancestor. So they might produce similar proteins, they might have similar structures. So as I was showing you, or talking about, right, that the whale, humans, and bats, right? So we've got the human, the whale, and the bat here. And it's showing the limb structure for these organisms. So these are what we call homologous structures. So these are features that are similar in structure due to having a common ancestor, but these structures may serve different functions. So related species evolve different adaptations based upon their environments. So we see the structures being very similar, right? They've color-coded the bones so that you can see how they relate between the human, the whale, and the bat, right? You see the phalanges, you see the humerus and the radius and the ulna, and here they're kind of long in humans. They've become shorter and thicker in the whale, but they're still also present in the bat. So for humans who are using their arms to reach and grab things and carry things versus the whale that's using it to help glide through the water and swim and helping steering, and the bat that's using it for flying. Obviously very different functions for these limbs, but when you look at the internal structure, they are all very similar, and that's due to them having a common mammalian ancestor that passed on their DNA, their developmental sequences of how to develop these bone structures, and they became modified over time to serve these different functions within these different environments. All right. I also have the example down here in the right-hand corner of a cactus flowers, beetroots, and there's like portulaca stems, and other flowers have special pigments that's called beta-alanines. And this is a pigment that's unlike other red pigments. So plants that have this beta-alanine pigment, they show a common ancestor from which they inherited how to produce that pigment. We also have what's called vestigial traits. So these are structures that basically have kind of lost their function, right? So most of the original function is no longer needed. And so through the process of evolution, they kind of remain present, but they're usually in very reduced forms. So we kind of see remnants of ancestry through these vestigial traits. So for example, humans have a tailbone. We call it the coccyx. That's at the end of our vertebral column. So it's deemed to be a remnant of a tail that was found in our primate ancestors. We have wisdom teeth, which were once useful for chewing tough plant material, but now, a lot of times people have their wisdom teeth removed based upon their jaw size, right? And it's no longer really necessary for our diet nowadays. The image here is showing the pelvic bones in the whale. So we talked earlier about the whale coming from an ancestor that used to walk on land, and there's remnants of those bones from its ancestors. All right, so over time, having reduced versions of these bones were probably deemed to be advantageous or selected for, and therefore those were then passed on. So these vestigial traits kind of highlight the evolutionary connections and demonstrate that modern organisms have been shaped by these very gradual changes from their ancestral forms. And then we also have the DNA evidence, right? So all living organisms on Earth use DNA. So regardless of whether we're talking about a whale or we're talking about a worm, they all have DNA, even plants, right? Even fungi, even the protists, right? So all of this uses the same exact genetic code, right? So we saw all the codons and the amino acids that they code for. All that's the same for all living things. So this is one, as it says, one of the strongest pieces of evidence that all living things evolved from a common ancestor. So here's an example of a DNA sequence. So it's showing the gene, or at least part of the gene for insulin, and it's comparing the human at the top with that of a chicken below it. And then we have a human compared with a mouse and a human compared with a chimpanzee. And in yellow, they're highlighting the differences in the base pairs. So for a human and a chicken on this first one, you see there's a cytosine in that position in the human gene, and in the chicken gene, there's a thymine in that position. So all of these yellow bands are highlighting the differences. So between humans and chickens, chickens are birds, we are mammals, there's some 240 out of 333. So there's 240 identical nucleotide sequences out of 330. If we compare a human to the mouse, so we're comparing two mammals that would have shared a mammalian ancestor, the number goes higher. So we see less differences in that gene sequence for insulin. If we compare humans to chimpanzees, which have a more recent ancestor, right? We are not descended from chimpanzees, but we are related to them. There are 328 out of 333. So 98% of that gene is the same as compared to other mammals or to other birds. So showing a much more closer relationship there. All right. Let's see how much of this you've understood. So we've got some questions here. So it says there are animals that have DNA sequences for genes for some of the same proteins as humans do. Did we not just see this? All right. So it says, what does this suggest? So you can take a moment, pause the video, and read the answers and form your own thoughts here. Okay, so the answer is humans and these animals evolved via common descent from a common ancestor, right? So that shows that common ancestry that they've passed on those genes, right? So we said in order for something to be inherited, it has to be based at the level of the DNA. We've got another one here. So it says, which of the following is not evidence for evolution by natural selection? So once again, pause the video, choose your answer from A, B, C, or D, and then unpause and you'll find out the answer. All right, so for this one, it says, during the Industrial Revolution, black soot from coal-burning smokestacks covered surfaces, including trees. Over generations, the population of mostly white-colored peppered moths became mostly dark-colored peppered moths. So we actually use this example as evidence for evolution, right? We were talking about natural selection. After Doug completed a course of antibiotic methicillin for an infection, he was hospitalized for MRSA, which is methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus infection. So we're seeing antibiotic resistance, right? We talked about that as well, how we can observe changes happening and accumulating in populations. So that's not true. The agricultural industry has developed varieties of tomatoes with characteristics as a large size, uniform red coloration, and roundness. So we're looking for the one that is not evidence for evolution. So this is, right, this is artificial selection that is happening because we're developing tomatoes. We're selecting tomatoes based on their size, the coloration, the roundness. These are the characteristics that we deem are valuable, and so we're selecting which individuals were the parents so that hopefully we would come out with these uniform red tomatoes. All right, but let's look at D. Many farmers view morning glories as a weed. 2 decades ago, the herbicide Roundup could be used to kill them. Today, the morning glories survive despite being sprayed with Roundup. So here we got pesticide resistance evolving in a population. All right, so one probably had some type of change in their DNA, and that enabled them to survive better once they were sprayed with this Roundup. Because they survived, they produced seeds, and those seeds grew up into individuals that carried that characteristic. Okay. So C is your correct answer here.